My project is about how creators of fiction, writers, authors, film directors, etc., write themselves into their own work, as inspired by John Fowles' appearance in The French Lieutenant's Woman when he pops up and starts changing the timeline all around. This topic is interesting to me for a number of reasons, not the least of which is why do writers of fiction so often feel the need to put their real or not so real selves into their made up worlds? There are, of course, probably many answers to this question. It isn't entirely possible to pinpoint exact reasons why this is a thing, but I am going to talk about a bunch of theories here. The other big questions when it comes to what I'm calling self-insertion by a writer are: one, what is the intended effect? What is the writer trying to accomplish, or what do we think they were trying to accomplish by putting themselves into the story? What does the creator get out of it? And two, what is the effect? What did we get out of it as an audience? What I'm trying to get at with all of these questions is the larger question of what's the point, if there is one? There are a few different ways of inserting oneself into one's own work of fiction. I think I've got it narrowed down to four main categories. The first one I want to discuss is the cameo appearance, specifically as it pertains to screenwriters and or directors putting themselves into their movies. Maybe the best example of this is Alfred Hitchcock. Hitchcock put himself into 40 or so of his 54 films. In some of these, he just walks through the frame in a blink or you'll miss it sort of way, but some of his cameos were far more creative than others. In this, still, he is kind of just on screen hanging out. And in this more comical one, he's sitting on the train, kind of minding his own business, and this little kid reaches over the seat and antagonizes him. Here's one where Hitch just walks through the frame, no big deal. But in Lifeboat, he does this very creative cameo in which he is the before in a before and after ad for weight loss on the back of a newspaper that one of the characters is reading. Then there's this one from Rope. See if you can catch it. So, what's the point here? Well, like most cameos, it seems to be largely just for fun. But it is also an artistic endeavor. I mean, walking through the frame is one thing, but Hitchcock got more creative with these over time. There's definitely a certain amount of ego involved, as in, it's my movie and I want to make sure I put my stamp on it. And besides all that, who wouldn't want to immortalize themselves on film? It did eventually become a game for Hitchcock to leave a little Easter egg for the viewer. And its effect on the audience, well, it was fun. Even if you don't pick up on it right away, it's a little game to be played for audiences, like a Where's Waldo kind of thing. Some other great examples of this are Stan Lee in all the Marvel movies, done a little differently and usually to comic effect, and Stephen King in most of the projects for which he's written the screenplays. Martin Scorsese is well known to show up in his films, even if it's hard to catch sometimes. Sometimes he even gives himself some important lines, like in Taxi Driver, where he appears as a character who gets into Travis's cab and describes how he plans to murder his own wife. I want to make a note of Hunter S. Thompson's cameo in Terry Gilliam's adaptation of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas as well, because Hunter will come up again later. This is important because there are certain writers who have a tendency to use these self-insertion techniques, and I think it points to a certain kind of personality, namely artists who seem to be aware of their own greatness. They often have a sense of humor about it, like King and Hitchcock, but sometimes it's something a little weirder. We'll get to that. The next type of self-insert I want to talk about is what I'm calling the author surrogate. And I'm going to break this down into two subcategories. The first one applies to movie directors again, not in walk-on roles, but as actual characters, in the style of Woody Allen, who, until he got older, always wrote in a character that he himself would play, often as the star of the film. Why? So he could say what he wanted to say in the way that he wanted to say it. Whatever point he was trying to make, he knew it could be made best if he did it himself. I mean, so many of his old films were about some neurotic idea he was trying to parse out anyways. Quentin Tarantino tends to write himself a role as well for similar but different reasons. He uses the character of Jimmy in Pulp Fiction to address some issues about racial language taboos, and in Reservoir Dogs, he's Mr. Brown, who appears mostly just to give this ridiculous speech about Madonna. Why? Well, Tarantino's author surrogates are injected into the story for the author's own purposes to express some kind of opinion that he wants to communicate to the audience himself. Spike Lee gives himself the role of Shorty in Malcolm X. Why? In an article from the African American Review about how Spike Lee altered the movie's original script, D. Quentin Miller points out that the first face we see in the script is Malcolm's, but the first face we see in Lee's film is his own, as Shorty, Malcolm's partner in crime in his hustling days. Spike is putting an emphasis on the effect Malcolm X has had on his own life. In Do the Right Thing, Spike plays the main character Woody Allen style. These are personal stories, and the creators deliver them personally. The second kind of author surrogate applies more to literature and involves creating a fictional character whose experiences mirror one's own. Moby Dick's Ishmael is said to have very similar characteristics to Herman Melville. Gregor in Metamorphosis is meant to resemble Kafka's relationship with his own family. And it's thought that Charles Dickens wrote David Copperfield about his own life and memories, but there is even a slightly more meta turn here. In Dickens Performs Dickens, a study of Dickens's prefaces to his books, Mario Robles Ortiz even says that the Dickensian Dickens is a character that Charles Dickens created for himself. Dickens, the consummate performer, is ventriloquizing Dickens, the most enduring among all his fictional creations. What he is suggesting here is that Charles Dickens, when writing as himself, is actually writing as the character Charles Dickens, whom he created for when he is communicating with his audience in the first person. This actually fits in a little better in the next part, and I'll get there momentarily. For now, I'm saying that the intended effect of writing fiction from your own experiences is to give your audience a believable story. It's not necessarily experimental, as it were. This is a tried and true way of telling a personal story, but it deserves mentioning in this context. As far as what the writer gets out of it, well, it's material to draw from for a fictional story. I think it's also far more comfortable, if you're going to write about your own experiences, to do it as a fictional character. It creates plausible deniability, if nothing else. It allows for embellishment and liberties that can be taken to make the story more interesting. The result for the audience is that we get realistic and relatable characters, even in Kafka, and maybe even some insight into the author's real life and thoughts. Now we start getting into the meatier stuff. The next type of self-insertion I want to talk about is the author as a character. This differentiates itself from the author surrogate because here the author is an actual character. I'm going to talk about a couple of examples that you might think fall into a bit of a gray area, but I thought about it a lot and I believe they fit better here. The first is Kilgore Trout, a character who critics view as Kurt Vonnegut's alter ego. Kilgore Trout was a rather unsuccessful writer of science fiction paperbacks whose works are mentioned repeatedly in Vonnegut's own books. Kurt Vonnegut is one of those guys who tends to be attracted to self-insertion as a technique. He has a cameo appearance in a film adaptation of his novel Mother Night, and he also shows up as himself in the 80s Rodney Dangerfield comedy Back to School. I swear this is real.
Hi, I'm Kurt Vonnegut.
Vonnegut ran a car dealership at one point in his life and also has a fictional alter ego, Phil Boyd Studge, who sells Pontiacs and goes nuts after he reads a story by Kilgore Trout in Kurt Vonnegut's novel Breakfast of Champions. Why is self-insertion such a commonly used technique by Vonnegut? In The Narrative Function of Kilgore Trout, Jesús LERATE de Castro says, "The presence of Trout indicates Vonnegut's preoccupation with the role of the author in society." In Slaughterhouse-Five, two war-torn characters are recovering from traumatic war experience in a psychiatric hospital, and they both attempt to give some meaning to their lives and seek in science fiction the means to reinvent themselves and their universe. In this context, Kilgore Trout's fiction offers them wonderful new lives to go on living. Vonnegut is using his self-insertion to justify his own existence, or maybe to explain why he does what he does. He's explaining why his failed sci-fi paperbacks have been a significant enough contribution to the world to have spent his life creating. Vonnegut is using his self-insertion to bring attention to certain themes in his books and balance out some of the more serious war material. Hunter S. Thompson used an alter ego in his writing as well. Raoul Duke was the main character in a few of his books, doing things in Thompson's life in place of himself. Duke was perpetually intoxicated on whatever drugs he could find and always tried to keep the 60s alive after the rest of the country had moved on. These were values of Thompson's, though it was Raoul Duke who usually chose to take part in Thompson's gonzo journalism. Duke was used so that Thompson could talk about himself. They were essentially the same person, but Raoul Duke tended to be an exaggerated version of Thompson. In the documentary film Fear and Loathing in Gonzo Vision, Thompson says, "I'm never sure which one people want me to be, and sometimes they conflict. I am living a normal life, but beside me is this myth, growing larger and getting more and more warped. I suppose that my plans are to figure out some new identity, kill off one life, and start another." Thompson committed suicide in 2005. Another notable example of the author as character is Dante Alighieri as Dante Alighieri in The Divine Comedy. Lawrence Baldassaro says in his paper, Dante the Pilgrim, Every Man as Sinner, as protagonist of his poem, Dante participates in the sins of the Inferno not because he himself had committed them, but because in his role as every man, he was capable, in his human weakness, of having committed them. Dante is using himself as a stand-in for the world full of sinners. I guess it comes off as pious on his part. He represents all the sinners of the world the same way Jesus absolved them, or whatever. Geoffrey Chaucer appears as himself in the Canterbury Tales as a guide for similar reasons. So what does the audience get out of all of this? In the case of Dante and Chaucer, I would argue almost nothing. There's no end to the desire of religious people's need to be a messiah figure, even if Dante does disguise himself as every man. Similar to the Hitchcock cameos, I think Dante and Chaucer's self-insertions clock in as ego-driven. I mean, the pilgrim and the guide could really have been anyone. This gets us to the last part. It's the most complicated, and it has to do with this. What does Bugs Bunny have to do with self-insertion? I'm calling this part writing yourself into the story as yourself who is writing the story which you are in while you write the story. In the Bugs Bunny cartoon, the animator's brush appears and draws things, right? Bugs is aware of these changes and breaks the fourth wall and starts talking to the animator, who reacts to Bugs by drawing something different, to which Bugs responds, and so on. But I find this fascinating. Whoever drew this cartoon had to animating himself, doing the animations, as well as animating Bugs Bunny, who is aware that he's being animated by the animator, animating the animator, and Bugs himself. I found a few great examples of this. These are what actually inspired this whole project. I'm going to start with something with which we are all familiar, having read the story for this class. It's also by far the simplest. In The French Lieutenant's Woman, John Fowles writes himself into the story. He kind of appears out of nowhere, like some kind of god, and pulls out his watch after the end of the story and twists the time back and allows the story to start over from a certain point, right? That's how we get our second ending, and it's loads of fun for everybody. In this critical essay I found, called The Novelist as Magus, John Fowles and the Function of Narrative, Frederick M. Holmes says this: by imposing imaginative designs on the world, the novelist necessarily plays God, even if, like Fowles, he would rather not. The novelist is still a god, says his narrator in The French Lieutenant's Woman, since he creates, and not even the most aleatory avant-garde modern novel has managed to extirpate its author completely. Now, let's get a couple of obvious things out of the way. First of all, aleatory. And second, extirpate. Okay. So, Fowles sees himself as the god of his own world, however reluctant. This is true, I suppose, but the author still has to live by certain rules like nature and time, especially in a Victorian novel like The French Lieutenant's Woman, right? I think it's not so reluctant. Now, I really want to talk about Stephen King in The Dark Tower. I'll try to break it down the best I can with just the broad strokes. In the early 80s, King started a magnum opus of sorts with a book called The Gunslinger. Over the course of the next 30 years or so, he added a few more books to the series, releasing one every 5 or 6 years. Then he got run over by a truck and almost died without finishing the story, and he, as well as his fans, worried that the series would go unfinished. So, as soon as he recovered, he sort of rushed the last few books and completed this story known as The Dark Tower. Where this gets really cool is in one of the last books of the series, a few of the characters get together and become aware somehow that it is Stephen King who is writing their story. So they devise a way to get to him, and they go and visit Stephen King to try and get him to finish the story so they can continue their journey. Hijinks ensue, but now Stephen King is a character in his story, writing the story about how he is the writer of the story he is writing. He's interacting with the characters in the book, and at one point they even assist in saving him from dying on the side of the road where he just got run over by a truck. There's even a section of the book where we meet this guy who's driving on the highway and is distracted and ends up running over Stephen King. The reason this is so cool to me is that King was saved by these characters in the book on two levels. As he struggled to survive in the hospital, his desire to finish his story helped him pull through, while at the same time, he decided to write in his story that the characters actually came and helped him survive. This is metafiction on a very cool level, and I think this is what experimental fiction is all about. Now, I would be crazy to leave out Charlie Kaufman, who was hired to write an adaptation of a book called The Orchid Thief, but starts to experience writer's block. So instead of just adapting the book, he starts writing himself into the screenplay, struggling with writer's block. But he's still writing the screenplay in the film, which ends up completely changing the story of The Orchid Thief, and incorporates a whole made-up story about the author of The Orchid Thief, and even invents a fake twin brother named Donald who antagonizes Charlie by writing a cliche screenplay about spies or something. When the screenplay is actually finished in real life, the movie gets made, and Charlie and Donald Kaufman both get writing credits on the resulting film. Now, remember, Donald Kaufman doesn't exist. So this is some weird mind-bending stuff, but I promised it would get really weird, so I'm going to finish with Grant Morrison, and then we'll wrap this thing up. Grant Morrison writes comic books for DC, among other things. The short version is that in the last issue of one of his comics, called Animal Man, Grant Morrison shows up in the story and talks to Animal Man. While they are meeting, Animal Man becomes unsure of whether he, Animal Man, is real or not. Grant Morrison assures Animal Man that he is, of course, real. He says, "Of course you're real. We wouldn't be talking if you weren't real. You existed before I wrote about you, and if you're lucky, you'll still be young when I'm old or dead. You're more real than I am." Which brings us, finally, to this. So Morrison wrote himself a fictional girlfriend for his comic book character, and then later claimed that she appeared in real life. Then he wanted another one, so he wrote another one. She apparently appeared as well. Then he wrote about some bacterial gods who attacked the comic book character Grant Morrison, who's still around for some reason. And a few months later, he got really sick with a bacterial infection. Then he was abducted by aliens, and, well, the important thing here is that Grant Morrison actually believes that our world is really just a giant comic book, and somehow he has learned how to tap into it and write changes. And we are all on our way to becoming gods. How's that for some experimental fiction? So, what does it all mean? Well, there's one word that seems to come up a lot in this section, and that is God. I'm trying to figure out why writers put themselves in their own fiction, and the answer is that by writing a story, you become God of your world. Fowles is certain of it. Morrison is absolutely certain of it. King is aware of it, and Charlie Kaufman, well, he created a real person, Donald Kaufman, who was nominated for an Academy Award for co-writing the film adaptation. That's true. Morrison is convinced that he can alter the actual world by writing about it. Stephen King wrote a short story many years ago called Word Processor of the Gods, in which the main character could type something into this old word processor, and it would manifest in the real world. So here's what it means to me. The world of fiction is not just fiction. It's real stuff created for real people in a real world. Fictional worlds mean a lot to people. I mean, have you ever seen those people at Comic-Con dressed up like wizards and superheroes, arguing about who would win in a fight between Superman and Yoda? This is a conversation I have actually had. The people who create these worlds are our gods, in a way. They allow us to travel to places we could never dream up ourselves. Fiction is not always just fictional. When someone who doesn't understand the importance of made-up worlds and stories laughs at me for reading too many fantasy novels, calls me a nerd or whatever, I feel sorry for them. Have you ever met someone who says, "Oh, I prefer to read nonfiction. I don't have time for hobbits and stormtroopers"? They are missing out on something real. The line between real and fictional is not always black and white. With experimental techniques like the ones we've been studying all semester, including self-insertion, writers are helping blur that line, and that is, I think, the most important part of what we have learned this semester. Imagination is not imaginary. Thanks for watching.